Canada holds something American farmers cannot grow their crops without: potash. It's the fertilizer nutrient that feeds corn, soybeans, and wheat across the entire farm belt, and Canada is the largest producer and exporter on Earth. The number that matters is this: the United States gets about 85% of its imported potash from Canada. A serious disruption in that supply would not stay a trade dispute for long. It would become an American farm crisis almost overnight. Start with why potash is such a powerful lever. It is one of the essential nutrients commercial agriculture cannot function without, and Canada dominates the global supply. Canada is the world's biggest potash producer and exporter by a wide margin, and the United States leans on that supply heavily. When 85% of your imported fertilizer nutrient comes from a single neighbor, that neighbor holds structural influence over your food production. American farmers do not have a domestic source large enough to replace it, which is exactly what turns potash into something that looks like leverage. This fertilizer story is suddenly drawing attention because it collides with the latest U.S. Canada trade fight. Washington has imposed new tariffs on selected Canadian goods, and fertilizer and potash have already been swept into the broader tariff battle over the past year. The pressure on fertilizer supply is not hypothetical. U.S. officials have treated it as serious enough to act on directly. In June 2026, the White House declared an emergency over phosphate supplies and temporarily suspended certain duties on phosphate fertilizer imported from Morocco. That move shows how urgently Washington views fertilizer availability. And it raises the central question: if American fertilizer supply is already strained enough to trigger an emergency declaration, what happens if the Canada-US potash supply chain gets worse? The Morocco phosphate emergency is the clearest signal of how tight the fertilizer picture already is. The White House fact sheet framed the temporary duty suspension as necessary to protect American farmers from fertilizer shortages and rising costs. That was for phosphate, a different nutrient, but it demonstrates the administration's willingness to intervene when fertilizer supply threatens the farm sector. Potash is a larger and more concentrated dependency than phosphate, and it flows overwhelmingly from Canada. If Washington was prepared to declare an emergency over Moroccan phosphate, the vulnerability on Canadian potash is significantly greater. Now, make it practical for the farmer, because this is where the impact actually lands. Farmers do not simply need fertilizer, they need it at the right moment in the growing cycle and at a price they can afford. Potash for spring planting is bought and delivered months in advance, and the timing is not flexible. If Canadian potash becomes more expensive or harder to obtain, American growers face higher input costs at precisely the point in the season when they have no room to wait. Some farmers might look for supply from other countries, but replacing such a large Canadian share is not something that happens quickly. The infrastructure, the contracts, and the logistics are all built around Canadian potash. The current fertilizer market shows those pressures are real and ongoing. Nutrien, one of the world's largest fertilizer companies, headquartered in Saskatchewan, reported higher fertilizer prices in its latest results, even as it missed profit estimates on lower volumes. Reuters documented that Nutrien's numbers reflected continued concerns about tight global fertilizer markets. Higher prices and constrained supply are not distant risks. They are showing up in the earnings of the companies that produce and sell the fertilizer American farmers depend on. When the dominant supplier reports rising prices amid tight markets, the cost pressure flows downstream to the growers. And if you want the real story behind how Canada is still holding its ground through tariffs, wars, and hard times, hit join below to join the membership for exclusive documentaries you won't see anywhere else about Canada's progress and rise through uncertainty. The alternatives to Canadian potash simply do not exist at the scale required. Russia and Belarus are the next largest global producers, but both are entangled in sanctions and geopolitical complications that make them unreliable substitutes for a stable, sanctions-free supply. There is no other producer capable of filling the gap Canada would leave if the trade relationship deteriorated. That is why the potash dependency is so structural, not because American farmers prefer Canadian potash, but because there is no practical alternative on the timeline a planting season demands. Building new domestic mining capacity takes close to a decade and billions in investment. Canadian officials have recognized potash as leverage in the trade dispute precisely because of this dependency. Throughout the conflict, potash has been named alongside energy and oil as one of the categories where Canada holds structural supply dominance that American buyers cannot circumvent. And Washington's own behavior confirms the leverage is real. When the administration signed its sweeping 50% tariffs on Canadian goods, potash was granted an exemption alongside energy and critical minerals, a direct acknowledgement that taxing potash would raise fertilizer costs for the American farm sector at a level Washington was unwilling to impose on its own agricultural base. But here's a twist that makes this story more complicated than a simple weapon. Canada cannot just flip a switch and turn off fertilizer to destroy American farming. The relationship runs in both directions. Canada itself relies heavily on the United States for phosphate fertilizer, a nutrient it does not produce in sufficient quantity domestically. The two countries have deeply interconnected fertilizer supply chains, with different nutrients flowing across the border in both directions. Canada dominates potash, the United States plays a larger role in phosphate. Disrupting the trade would not cleanly damage only one side. Fertilizer Canada, the industry association representing Canadian producers, made exactly this point in its response to the North American tariffs. The organization warned that tariffs on fertilizer moving across the border would harm producers and farmers on both sides, disrupting a supply chain that has been integrated for decades. Canadian potash producers depend on American buyers, just as American farmers depend on Canadian potash. A full trade war on fertilizer would raise costs, disrupt logistics, and damage agricultural producers in both countries simultaneously. That mutual dependency is what makes the weapon framing so complicated. Canada does hold enormous leverage through potash, 85% of American imports, no viable alternative supplier, and a farm belt that cannot function without it. But wielding that leverage aggressively would carry a cost for Canada too. Canadian potash producers rely on the American market as their largest customer. Cutting off or heavily restricting that flow would hurt Saskatchewan's producers, reduce their revenue, and damage the very industry the leverage is built on. The weapon, if used fully, points partly back at the hand holding it. The G7 Agriculture Ministers meeting in June 2026 reflected how central fertilizer security has become to the broader food supply conversation. Canada's Agriculture Minister participated in discussions on global food security and supply chain resilience, underscoring that fertilizer availability is now treated as a matter of international economic importance. Fertilizer is no longer just an agricultural input. It is a strategic resource that governments are actively managing, and the Canada-U.S. potash relationship sits at the center of North American food security. So, the real question is sharper than it first appears. Canada holds a genuine fertilizer advantage through potash, a dependency so structural that Washington exempted it from its own tariffs and declared an emergency over a related nutrient. American farmers face real risk if that supply becomes more expensive or harder to reach, with Nutrien already reporting higher prices in a tight market. But the supply chains run both ways. Canada needs American phosphate, and the industry on both sides warns that disruption would inflict mutual damage. Is Canada actually holding a fertilizer weapon it can use freely, or would a full trade war turn that same weapon back on Canadian farmers?